The coldest nights are not the ones filled with snow. They are the ones when the people you love decide you no longer belong. My name is Ethan Carter, and on Christmas Eve I stood barefoot on the front steps of the house I had called home for almost 15 years, holding nothing more than a small suitcase and the winter coat my wife had tossed into my hands moments earlier. Snow drifted quietly across the quiet neighborhood, settling on the stone walkway and the carefully decorated pine trees that lined the driveway. White lights sparkled along the roof, a glowing wreath hung proudly on the front door, and cheerful Christmas music floated through the windows as though nothing extraordinary had just happened. To anyone driving past, it looked like the perfect American family celebrating the holidays. Only I knew that my marriage had just ended before midnight. Olivia stood inside the doorway with her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her elegant red sweater and cream-colored scarf matched the festive decorations surrounding her, but the warmth of Christmas never reached her expression. Behind her stood nearly every member of her family. Her parents watched silently. Her younger brother leaned against the hallway wall with a satisfied smile. Her aunt whispered something that caused two cousins to laugh softly. They all believed they were witnessing the final chapter of a disappointing husband who had never lived up to their expectations. Olivia looked directly into my eyes before speaking. "Ethan, this cannot continue anymore." Her voice remained calm, almost rehearsed. "We have spent years pretending everything is fine. My family has watched you drift through life without ambition, without direction, and without contributing the way a husband should. I am tired of defending choices I no longer understand." I lowered my eyes for only a moment before answering quietly. "If this is truly what you want, I will respect your decision." My response seemed to surprise several people standing behind her. Perhaps they expected an argument. Perhaps they expected me to beg for another chance. Instead, I simply accepted that forcing someone to stay has never been the same as being loved. Olivia reached toward the small table beside the entrance and handed me an envelope containing legal documents prepared earlier that week. "The attorney said we can finalize everything after the holidays," she said. "Tonight, I only want you to leave." I accepted the envelope without opening it. Snowflakes landed softly across the paper before melting into tiny drops of water. Her father finally stepped forward. "You are a decent man, Ethan," he said. "But decency alone does not build a future. Olivia deserves someone who can give her more." I nodded respectfully. "I hope she finds happiness." Her brother laughed under his breath. "That is probably the smartest thing you have ever said." More quiet laughter followed. I did not respond. There are moments when silence protects more dignity than any clever reply ever could. I looked around the living room one final time. A beautifully decorated Christmas tree stood beside the fireplace, covered with ornaments collected over many years. I remembered hanging each one together. The ceramic angel from our first Christmas. The wooden snowflake we bought during a weekend trip to Vermont. The small silver bell Olivia insisted brought good luck. Every decoration carried a memory, yet none of those memories seemed strong enough to remain inside the house tonight. I gently placed my wedding ring on the small table beside the envelope. Olivia noticed the gesture, but said nothing. For just a second, I thought I saw uncertainty pass across her face, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. "Take care of yourself," I said softly. She hesitated before replying. "You too." Without another word, I picked up my suitcase, buttoned my coat, and stepped into the falling snow. The heavy wooden door closed behind me with a quiet sound that somehow echoed louder than every conversation we had shared throughout our marriage. I stood there for a few moments, breathing in the cold December air while snow continued collecting on my shoulders. The neighborhood remained peaceful. Nearby homes glowed with colorful lights. Children laughed somewhere in the distance while parents carried wrapped presents from parked cars. Christmas continued for everyone else. I slowly began walking toward the front gate, my footsteps leaving fresh tracks across the untouched snow. I had no destination in mind, only the certainty that life sometimes begins again in the exact place where everything appears to end. As I reached the sidewalk, bright headlights appeared at the far end of the quiet street. A long black limousine turned the corner and moved steadily toward the house. At first I assumed it belonged to one of the neighbors returning from a holiday party, but instead of passing by, the vehicle slowed until it stopped directly beside me. Before I could take another step, the rear passenger door opened from the inside. An elderly gentleman wearing an immaculate black overcoat stepped onto the snow, removed his gloves, and offered a respectful bow. His expression carried neither surprise nor urgency, only quiet relief. He looked at me with unmistakable recognition and spoke words I had not heard in many years. "Welcome home, Mr. Carter. The family has been waiting for their only heir." Ethan stared at the elderly gentleman for several silent seconds while snow continued drifting between them, soft flakes settling across the shoulders of his dark winter coat. The words echoed inside his mind with a familiarity he had spent years trying to forget. "Welcome home, Mr. Carter. The family has been waiting for their only heir." He slowly released a quiet breath before offering a faint smile that carried more exhaustion than surprise. "It has been a long time, Charles," he said gently. The older man returned the smile with genuine warmth. "Far too long, sir." Charles stepped aside and held the limousine door open without another word. Ethan glanced once toward the brightly decorated house behind him. Through the large front window, he could still see Olivia's family gathered around the Christmas tree. Someone raised another glass in celebration, while cheerful music floated through the room. No one bothered looking outside. No one noticed the elegant limousine parked only a few yards from the front gate. No one imagined that the quiet husband they had just dismissed was being welcomed with extraordinary respect. Ethan picked up his small suitcase and entered the vehicle. The warm leather interior immediately contrasted with the freezing winter air outside. A small reading lamp cast a soft golden glow across polished wood accents and neatly arranged documents resting on a side table. Charles closed the door before taking the seat across from him. The driver pulled away from the curb so smoothly that the snow beneath the tires barely made a sound. For several minutes, neither man spoke. The neighborhood slowly disappeared behind them as Christmas lights reflected across the windows like distant memories fading into the night. Finally, Charles broke the silence. "I am deeply sorry for what happened this evening." Ethan looked toward the passing streets. "You were watching?" Charles nodded respectfully. "We arrived a few minutes before midnight, as instructed by the board. We did not intend to intrude, but we witnessed enough to understand the situation." Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. "Then you also saw that they believed they were making the right decision?" Charles hesitated before replying. "With respect, sir, they believed they understood the man standing before them. That is very different." Ethan smiled sadly. "Perhaps." Charles reached into a leather portfolio and carefully removed a sealed envelope embossed with an elegant silver crest. He placed it gently on the table between them. "This was prepared by the family council. They requested that I deliver it to you personally the moment you agreed to return." Ethan studied the familiar crest without opening the envelope. The symbol represented a life he had intentionally left behind many years earlier. A life built upon influence, responsibility, and expectations that had once seemed impossible to carry. "How is my grandfather?" he asked quietly. Charles lowered his head slightly. "His health has declined over the past several months. He insisted on postponing every major decision until you returned. He believes only one member of the family possesses both the judgment and the character to guide Carter Global into its next generation." Ethan remained silent. Outside the window, the city skyline gradually replaced quiet suburban streets. Snow continued falling over office towers, churches, bridges, and apartment buildings where families celebrated Christmas together. "I walked away for a reason," Ethan finally said. Charles nodded. "Everyone knows." Ethan looked toward him. "Do they?" The older man smiled gently. "They know you refused to inherit a fortune before proving you could build a meaningful life without it. They know you wanted to be valued for your character rather than your last name. Whether they understood your decision at the time is another matter." Ethan rested one hand on the unopened envelope. "And now?" Charles answered without hesitation. "Now they understand." Silence returned once more. The limousine crossed the river as shimmering reflections danced across the dark water below. Ethan remembered the day he left the Carter estate carrying only one suitcase and a promise to himself. He would build a life that belonged to him alone. He would never introduce himself through wealth or influence. If someone loved him, it would be because of the man he chose to become rather than the family into which he had been born. For many years he believed he had succeeded. He had found Olivia. They had laughed together inside a small apartment. They had shared simple dreams and celebrated modest victories. Somewhere along the way, however, appearances quietly replaced understanding. Success became measured by titles instead of kindness. Worth became measured by visible accomplishments instead of unseen sacrifices. Charles watched him thoughtfully. Do you regret leaving all those years ago? Ethan answered almost immediately. No. Even after tonight? Ethan looked out the window once more as the limousine approached a private road lined with towering evergreen trees wrapped in soft white lights. Especially after tonight, he replied. Because now I know I never abandoned my values. I simply placed them in the wrong hands. The limousine slowed before an enormous set of wrought iron gates bearing the Carter family crest. Security officers recognized the vehicle immediately, and the gates opened without delay. Beyond them stretched a long, snow-covered driveway leading toward an elegant estate illuminated against the winter sky. Warm lights glowed from nearly every window. Several vehicles already waited near the entrance. As the limousine came to a gentle stop beneath the grand portico, Charles stepped out first before opening Ethan's door once again. He offered the same respectful bow as before, though this time his voice carried unmistakable emotion. Welcome home, Mr. Carter. They have waited 12 years for this moment, and everyone inside believes Christmas can finally begin. The grand entrance doors opened before Ethan reached them, and warm golden lights spilled across the snow-covered steps as several members of the household staff quietly lined the marble foyer. None of them applauded. None of them rushed toward him. Instead, each person simply offered a respectful nod that reflected years of loyalty rather than obligation. Ethan paused for a brief moment before stepping inside, brushing the snow from his coat. The familiar scent of fresh pine, polished wood, and cinnamon filled the air, instantly carrying him back to Christmas mornings he had not experienced in more than a decade. The estate looked almost exactly as he remembered. The sweeping staircase still curved gracefully beneath an enormous crystal chandelier. A towering Christmas tree stood proudly in the center of the foyer, decorated with white lights, silver ribbons, and handcrafted ornaments collected over generations. Portraits of Carter family members lined the walls, each quietly observing the newest chapter of a story that had begun long before Ethan was born. Charles accepted Ethan's suitcase before speaking softly. Everyone is gathered in the east drawing room. Ethan gave a small nod. How long have they been waiting? Charles smiled gently. Long enough to stop asking whether you would return. Not long enough to stop hoping. Ethan followed him through the wide hallway, his footsteps echoing softly across polished marble floors. Every room carried memories he had carefully tucked away over the years. The library where his father taught him to read annual reports before he was old enough to understand them. The music room where his mother played the piano every Christmas Eve until illness slowly stole her strength. The sunroom where his grandfather spent quiet mornings teaching him that wealth could create opportunities but never character. Those lessons had stayed with Ethan far longer than the estate itself. As they approached the drawing room, Charles stopped beside a large walnut door. Before you go in, he said quietly, there is something you should know. Ethan looked toward him. Your grandfather has refused every proposal regarding succession since you left. Every board member, every attorney, every advisor offered alternatives. He declined them all. He always said the future of this family would never be decided by intelligence alone. It required kindness, patience, and humility. He believed only one person possessed all three. Ethan remained silent for several seconds before placing one hand on the polished brass handle. I hope he was right. Charles smiled. So do we all. Ethan slowly opened the door. Conversations inside immediately faded into complete silence. Nearly 20 people stood throughout the elegant drawing room. Senior executives, longtime family advisors, several elderly relatives, a few trusted friends who had known him since childhood. No one looked shocked to see him. Their expressions reflected relief more than surprise, as though something missing for many years had finally returned to its proper place. At the far end of the room, seated beside a roaring stone fireplace, was his grandfather, William Carter. Time had noticeably changed him. His hair had become completely white, his posture slightly weaker, and a polished wooden cane rested beside his chair. Yet his blue eyes remained exactly as Ethan remembered, calm, thoughtful, and quietly observant. The older man slowly stood with the assistance of the cane. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. 12 years of distance disappeared into a single glance. Then William smiled. Merry Christmas, Ethan. Emotion quietly settled inside Ethan's chest. Merry Christmas, Grandpa. They embraced gently, neither speaking for several seconds. There were no dramatic speeches, no elaborate apologies, only the simple comfort of family reunited after years apart. When they finally stepped back, William rested one hand on Ethan's shoulder. You kept your promise. Ethan smiled faintly. I tried. William nodded with quiet satisfaction. When you left, you told me you would return only after proving you could build a meaningful life without relying on the Carter name. I never doubted you. I only wondered how long the journey would take. Ethan glanced briefly toward the glowing fireplace. Longer than I expected. William noticed the sadness behind those words. Something happened tonight. It was not a question. Ethan answered honestly. My marriage ended. The room grew even quieter. William looked into his grandson's eyes before asking softly, Did you leave with your dignity? Ethan answered without hesitation. Yes. The older man smiled warmly. Then you did not lose as much as you think. Several family members quietly nodded in agreement. William gestured toward the comfortable chair beside his own. Sit with me. Ethan accepted. A cup of hot coffee was placed gently on the small table between them. The warmth rising from the cup reminded him how long it had been since anyone had simply prepared something because they cared. William reached into the pocket of his cardigan and removed a small silver key attached to an old leather keychain. He placed it carefully into Ethan's hand. Tomorrow morning, he said, the board of Carter Global will officially ask you to become chairman. Every legal document has already been prepared. But before you answer them, I want you to answer only one question. Ethan looked toward him. William's voice remained calm and steady. After everything that happened tonight, will you lead this family because you desire power or because you still believe responsibility is an act of service? Ethan closed his fingers gently around the small silver key. Outside, snow continued falling peacefully beyond the tall windows, while inside the old estate every person waited silently for the answer that would shape not only the future of the Carter family, but the beginning of Ethan's new life. Ethan looked at the small silver key resting in his hand before slowly closing his fingers around it. The polished metal felt unexpectedly familiar, carrying memories that had remained untouched for years. He lifted his eyes toward his grandfather and answered without hesitation. If I accept this responsibility, it will never be because of power. I left this family to learn that titles can open doors, but they cannot build trust. If I return, it will be because thousands of employees deserve leadership that remembers they are people before they are numbers. William Carter smiled quietly, and the deep lines around his eyes softened with unmistakable pride. That, he said, is the answer I hoped you would give. Around the drawing room, several longtime advisors exchanged relieved glances. They had spent years protecting a company that had grown into one of the largest privately held corporations in the country, but they also understood that wealth alone could not preserve its future. Character would always matter more than capital. William slowly settled back into his chair and gestured for everyone else to do the same. A fire crackled gently inside the stone fireplace, while fresh snow continued drifting beyond the tall windows overlooking the estate grounds. Christmas music played quietly somewhere in the distance, creating a peaceful contrast to everything Ethan had experienced only an hour earlier. Charles placed another folder on the coffee table before Ethan. These are summaries only, he explained. The complete reports will be presented tomorrow morning during the board meeting. We thought tonight should remain focused on family. Ethan appreciated the gesture. For the first time in many years, no one expected him to solve a problem immediately. They simply welcomed him home. William studied his grandson thoughtfully before speaking again. There is something you should know before tomorrow. Carter Global has remained profitable, but the world has changed. Markets have changed. Expectations have changed. Several board members believe the company should pursue aggressive expansion regardless of the long-term consequences. Ethan listened carefully. And what do you believe? William answered without hesitation. I believe businesses should create opportunity, not simply quarterly headlines. Your father believed the same thing. At the mention of his father, Ethan glanced toward a framed photograph resting on the mantel above the fireplace. It showed a younger William standing beside Ethan's parents during another Christmas many years ago. His father wore the same calm expression Ethan saw each morning in his own mirror. His mother smiled warmly while holding a cup of coffee, completely unaware that a simple family photograph would one day become a treasured memory. "He would have been proud of you," William said softly, following Ethan's gaze. Ethan remained silent for several moments before replying. "Everything I understand about responsibility began with him." The room grew comfortably quiet. No one felt the need to interrupt memories with unnecessary conversation. Finally, Charles spoke again. "There is one additional matter, sir." Ethan turned toward him. Charles carefully opened another folder and removed several documents along with a tablet displaying recent financial news. These arrived throughout the evening. Ethan accepted the tablet. Across multiple business publications, one headline appeared repeatedly. "Carter Global announces emergency board session following chairman transition." Another article speculated that the mysterious heir who had refused public attention for more than a decade might finally return. None of the reports included his photograph. None of them confirmed his identity. The business world only knew that an announcement was expected after Christmas. William smiled faintly. "For years, journalists tried to discover where you had gone. We never answered a single question." Ethan looked up. "Thank you. It was never our story to tell." Charles pointed toward another page. "Your return remains confidential. Only the board, senior legal advisors, and immediate family members have been informed. By tomorrow afternoon, the entire financial community will know." Ethan nodded thoughtfully before placing the tablet aside. "Then tomorrow changes many lives." William gently tapped the armrest with his cane. "Including yours." Ethan understood exactly what he meant. Once his identity became public, there would be no returning to anonymity. The quiet life he had carefully built would become impossible to recover. Yet strangely, he felt no fear, only clarity. Sometimes life chooses the timing we spend years trying to avoid. A member of the household staff entered quietly carrying a tray filled with hot chocolate, coffee, and freshly baked Christmas cookies. William smiled warmly. One tradition has never changed. Ethan laughed softly for the first time that evening. Mother always insisted no family discussion could continue without cookies. William chuckled. Your mother was usually right. The simple conversation reminded Ethan that true wealth had never been measured by estates, boardrooms, or investment portfolios. It lived inside ordinary moments, shared with people who genuinely cared whether you found peace. Hours earlier, he had stood outside another house where his departure had been quietly celebrated. Now he sat surrounded by people who had waited 12 years simply to welcome him home. The contrast was impossible to ignore. As midnight slowly gave way to Christmas morning, William looked around the room before speaking one final time. Everyone should get some rest. Tomorrow we begin a new chapter for this family. Ethan rose alongside the others and walked toward one of the large windows overlooking the snow-covered grounds. Beyond the gardens, the lights of the city shimmered beneath the winter sky. Somewhere out there, Olivia believed she had closed the door on an ordinary man with an ordinary future. She could not possibly know that before sunrise, the same man would accept a responsibility that would quietly reshape the future of one of the nation's largest family enterprises. Ethan rested one hand lightly against the cool glass, watching snow continue to fall in complete silence, while behind him the grandfather who had never stopped believing quietly whispered to Charles, "Tomorrow the world will finally meet the man we have been waiting for." Christmas morning arrived beneath a pale winter sky, and the Carter estate awakened with a quiet sense of purpose, rather than celebration. Snow still covered the gardens, reflecting the soft glow of sunrise across the frozen fountain and long stone pathways leading toward the main entrance. Ethan stood alone on the balcony outside his childhood bedroom, with a cup of black coffee warming his hands. The peaceful silence reminded him how different this Christmas felt from everyone before it. Only hours earlier, he had been standing outside another home with nowhere to go. Now he found himself preparing to accept responsibilities that would influence thousands of families across the country. Charles quietly stepped onto the balcony carrying a neatly pressed navy suit inside a protective garment bag. "Good morning, sir," he said with a respectful smile. "The board meeting begins at 10 o'clock. Your grandfather asked me to remind you that breakfast will be served whenever you are ready." Ethan accepted the suit with a grateful nod. "How is he this morning?" Charles looked toward the snowy gardens before answering. "Better than he has been in months. Hope has a remarkable effect on people." Ethan smiled faintly. "I believe it does." Inside the estate, the dining room had already filled with several trusted advisors and longtime family members sharing a simple Christmas breakfast. No one discussed business while food remained on the table. William insisted that family always came before corporate decisions, regardless of the size of the company waiting outside those walls. During breakfast, he asked Ethan about ordinary things instead. The drive through the mountains years ago, his favorite books, whether he still enjoyed restoring old furniture during weekends. Those simple questions reminded Ethan that the people who truly cared about him had always been interested in his life rather than his title. Shortly after 9 o'clock, everyone gathered inside the estate library. Large windows overlooked the snow-covered grounds, while several screens displayed financial reports prepared for the morning meeting. Margaret Lawson, Carter Global's chief legal officer, entered carrying the final succession documents. She greeted Ethan warmly before placing the folders on the polished conference table. "Everything has been confirmed," she said. "The board has unanimously approved today's agenda. Upon your acceptance, you will officially become executive chairman of Carter Global." Ethan quietly reviewed the documents without rushing. Every page represented years of planning that had continued while he remained absent from the public eye. William watched his grandson carefully before speaking. "Never let the weight of these papers convince you that leadership begins with signatures. Leadership begins with the decisions made after the ink dries." Ethan nodded respectfully. "I will remember that." At exactly 9:30, another advisor entered carrying a tablet. "The financial news networks have begun reporting increased activity," he said. "Speculation is growing quickly. Everyone expects a major announcement before noon." Ethan glanced at the screen. Headlines continued appearing one after another. Carter Global expected to name new chairman. Mystery heir finally returning. Historic leadership transition scheduled today. None of the articles contained his photograph. None mentioned his years away from the family. To the outside world, he remained little more than an unanswered question. Hundreds of miles away, Olivia sat quietly in her parents' living room while scrolling through the same financial headlines on her phone. She had planned to spend Christmas relaxing after making what she believed had been a difficult but necessary decision. Instead, she found herself staring at the repeated appearance of one familiar name. Carter. Something about it unsettled her. She remembered Ethan mentioning the name once years earlier after receiving an unexpected telephone call. When she asked about it, he had smiled politely and changed the subject. At the time, she assumed it involved an ordinary client. Now that forgotten memory returned with surprising clarity. Her younger brother glanced toward her from the sofa. "What is everyone talking about?" Olivia handed him the phone. "Apparently, the Carter family is announcing their only heir today." He shrugged after reading the headline. "Must be another billionaire story." Olivia forced a small smile, but something inside her refused to settle. Tiny moments she had ignored over the years began quietly returning. Ethan's unusual knowledge of corporate acquisitions. The respected executives who occasionally greeted him by name during charity events. The confidential telephone calls that always ended before dinner. The old leather notebook he never allowed anyone else to read. None of those memories had seemed important before. Together, they suddenly felt connected. Back at the estate, Charles approached Ethan with a final update. "The board members have all arrived." Ethan placed the signed acceptance documents back inside the folder and slowly stood. William rose with the assistance of his cane before walking toward him. Without saying anything at first, the older man gently straightened Ethan's tie exactly as he had done on Ethan's first day of college many years earlier. "Your father would have done the same thing," William said quietly. Ethan smiled with grateful eyes. "Thank you." William rested one hand on his shoulder. "Today people will admire your position. Never forget that your character earned their trust long before your title ever existed." Those words remained with Ethan as he walked through the grand hallway toward the waiting limousine. Snow continued falling softly outside while reporters and camera crews gathered beyond the estate gates. Completely unaware that the quiet man stepping into the waiting vehicle had spent 12 years proving to himself that he could build a meaningful life without the fortune he had been born to inherit. As the limousine pulled away toward Carter Global headquarters, Ethan looked once through the rear window at the estate growing smaller behind him. Ahead waited the boardroom where his identity would finally become public. Behind him remained the only home that had welcomed him back without asking what he owned. because it had always remembered who he was. Ethan arrived at Carter Global headquarters a few minutes before 10 o'clock. The 60-story glass tower reflected the bright winter sun, while fresh snow rested along the wide stone plaza leading to the entrance. News vehicles lined the opposite side of the street. Their satellite antennas pointed toward the sky as reporters waited behind security barriers, hoping to capture the first glimpse of the mysterious heir, whose name had fueled financial headlines throughout the morning. The limousine stopped beneath the covered entrance, and Charles stepped out first before opening Ethan's door. Several members of the executive security team greeted him with respectful smiles. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," one of them said. Ethan returned the greeting with a simple nod before walking through the revolving doors. Inside, the grand lobby felt surprisingly calm despite the attention gathering outside. Employees moved professionally between reception desks and elevators, many unaware that the company's future was only minutes away from changing forever. Those who recognized Charles quietly exchanged curious looks, but quickly returned to their work. Ethan appreciated that. Real professionals understood the difference between curiosity and distraction. The executive elevator opened as soon as they approached. Daniel Reeves, the company's chief operating officer, waited inside wearing a dark gray suit and a composed expression. He extended his hand warmly. "Welcome back, Mr. Carter. We have been preparing for this day for a very long time." Ethan shook his hand. "Thank you, Daniel. How is everyone upstairs?" Daniel smiled politely. "Confident on the outside, nervous on the inside. Most of the board knows your reputation through reports, but very few have ever met you." The elevator climbed smoothly toward the executive floor, while digital numbers quietly counted upward. Ethan looked at the city stretching beyond the glass walls. Somewhere across town, Olivia was likely driving toward her parents' house after another restless morning, still trying to understand why the Carter name continued echoing through every business headline. She had no reason to believe her life was about to intersect with those headlines in a way she could never have imagined. The elevator doors opened onto the executive level, where several board members already waited near the conference room. One after another, they stepped forward to greet Ethan with genuine respect, rather than exaggerated ceremony. Some had silver hair earned through decades of leadership. Others represented a younger generation chosen for vision and integrity. None of them commented on his absence from the public eye. Instead, they welcomed him as though he had simply returned from a long journey that had finally reached its destination. Margaret Lawson approached, carrying the final agenda. "Everything is prepared," she said. "The legal transition documents are ready for signature after the vote. The press conference has been scheduled for this afternoon, although your grandfather instructed us not to rush you if you wish to delay public remarks." Ethan appreciated the consideration. "Thank you. Let us finish our responsibilities first." The boardroom doors opened quietly. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the entire downtown skyline, while a polished walnut table stretched through the center of the room. Every seat had already been prepared with neatly organized reports, financial summaries, and governance documents. At the head of the table stood a single leather chair that had remained empty for years, while William Carter waited for the right successor. Ethan paused for a brief moment before taking his place, not because he doubted himself, but because he understood the weight of what the chair represented. Leadership is never inherited by blood alone. It must also be earned through character. Within minutes, every director had arrived. William entered last with Charles beside him. Although age had slowed his steps, the respect shown throughout the room made it clear that his influence remained undiminished. Once everyone had taken their seats, Margaret stood and formally opened the meeting. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this special Christmas session of the Carter Global Board of Directors. Our first item concerns the succession plan approved unanimously by the Governance Committee." She paused before turning toward William. The older man slowly rose with the support of his cane. His voice remained calm, steady, and filled with quiet conviction. "Many years ago, I told this board that I would step aside only when I found someone who understood that leadership begins with service. Today, I am pleased to present the man who spent 12 years proving exactly that, not inside this building, but out in the real world where titles cannot replace integrity." Every eye in the room turned toward Ethan. William continued. He walked away from unimaginable privilege because he wanted to discover who he could become without it. He built his own career, accepted ordinary disappointments, lived without public recognition, and never once used the Carter name to open a single door. That is why I trust him to protect the future of this company. Silence settled across the room before the directors began applauding, not loudly or dramatically, but with the sincere respect reserved for someone whose actions had already spoken long before introductions were necessary. Ethan slowly stood, looked around the table, and offered a modest smile. "Thank you for your confidence," he said. "I cannot promise that every decision I make will satisfy every person. I can promise that every decision will be guided by honesty, responsibility, and respect for the people whose work built this company long before I returned." Several directors nodded in agreement. Margaret then placed the official succession documents before him. Ethan accepted the fountain pen resting beside the folder and looked briefly toward his grandfather. William gave a quiet approving nod. Ethan lowered the pen to the paper and signed his name with steady hands. At that exact moment, every notification system connected to Carter Global updated simultaneously. Executive Chairman, Ethan Carter. Across the financial world, screens refreshed almost instantly. Newsrooms received the announcement. Stock market analysts paused their holiday coverage. Reporters outside the headquarters hurried to prepare breaking updates. And several miles away, Olivia's phone vibrated with an urgent news alert displaying a photograph she had never expected to see beside the headline announcing the identity of Carter Global's only heir. Ethan lowered the fountain pen and gently closed the leather folder containing the signed succession documents. No dramatic celebration followed. There were no triumphant speeches or congratulatory embraces that lingered too long. Instead, the room settled into a respectful silence that reflected the seriousness of the responsibility he had just accepted. William Carter looked toward every director seated around the table before speaking one final time. "The future of this company is now in capable hands. I ask each of you to support our new chairman with the same honesty you have always shown me." Around the long conference table, every director nodded in agreement. Several had spent decades serving beside William. They understood that leadership transitions rarely happened with such complete confidence. Margaret Lawson quietly gathered the signed documents while Daniel Reeves updated the official corporate records. At exactly 10:35, the transition became legally complete. Ethan Carter was now the executive chairman of Carter Global. Outside the headquarters, reporters immediately noticed activity inside the executive floor. Cameras turned toward the main entrance while television correspondents prepared breaking news updates. Across the country, business channels interrupted their holiday programming with photographs of Ethan standing beside his grandfather taken only moments earlier inside the boardroom. The mystery surrounding the Carter family's only heir had officially ended. Several miles away, Olivia sat alone in the quiet guest bedroom of her parents' home, unable to stop staring at the notification glowing across her phone screen. The article displayed a large photograph that had been captured during the announcement. Ethan stood beside William Carter wearing the same navy suit he had left the estate wearing earlier that morning. Beneath the photograph appeared a headline that seemed impossible to believe. Carter Global officially names Ethan Carter as executive chairman and sole family successor. Olivia read the article once, then again, then a third time. Every sentence seemed to erase another assumption she had carried throughout their marriage. Her breathing became slower as memories she had ignored for years quietly returned. She remembered the elderly gentleman who had once called Ethan during dinner and politely addressed him as Mr. Carter. Ethan had simply stepped outside to finish the conversation before returning with a gentle smile, explaining that it was business. She remembered expensive charity galas where influential executives always seemed unusually respectful toward him. She remembered asking once why complete strangers greeted him so warmly. Ethan had answered with a quiet laugh, saying kindness often travels farther than people realize. At the time, she thought he was avoiding the question. Now she understood he had simply answered honestly without revealing more than necessary. Her younger brother walked into the room carrying a cup of coffee. "You have been staring at that phone for almost 15 minutes, he said casually. Olivia silently handed him the device. His confident expression disappeared almost immediately. "Wait," he whispered. "This cannot be the same Ethan." Their father entered moments later after hearing the conversation. He adjusted his reading glasses before taking the phone. As he slowly read the article, the room became completely silent. The photograph left no room for doubt. The quiet man they had dismissed the previous evening now stood beside one of the country's most respected business leaders as his officially recognized successor. Olivia's father lowered the phone slowly. "We made a terrible mistake." No one argued with him. There was nothing left to defend. Back inside Carter Global headquarters, the formal meeting concluded and several directors began leaving for scheduled interviews and holiday obligations. Ethan remained behind with William, Margaret, and Daniel to review employee initiatives planned for the coming year. Ethan carefully read every proposal before stopping at one particular report. It outlined reductions affecting several regional offices. He looked toward Daniel. How many families would this impact? Daniel answered honestly. Approximately 300 employees. Ethan closed the report. Then we need another solution. Margaret looked up. The projections indicate these changes would improve profitability. Ethan nodded. Perhaps. But if we can strengthen the company without asking 300 families to spend the holidays worrying about their future, then that is the path I want explored first. Daniel smiled quietly. I suspected you would say that. William leaned back in his chair with unmistakable satisfaction. This is exactly why I waited. Ethan looked toward his grandfather. A business should never forget the people who make success possible. William nodded. Your father used to repeat those exact words. For several moments, no one spoke. The conversation had moved beyond profits and corporate strategy into something much more important. It had become a discussion about values. Ethan finally stood and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Snow continued falling gently across rooftops, parks, and busy streets where families celebrated Christmas together. Somewhere beyond those buildings, Olivia was discovering that the man she believed she understood had spent years quietly protecting a truth that was never meant to impress anyone. Ethan did not feel satisfaction at that realization. He felt only sadness that honesty had arrived too late to save what once mattered most. As he watched the snow drift across the skyline, his phone vibrated softly for the first time since the announcement. The screen displayed a single name, Olivia. Beneath it appeared 3 simple words that carried the weight of 15 years together. We need to talk. The phone continued vibrating quietly in Ethan's hand while the words on the screen remained unchanged. We need to talk. He looked at the message for several seconds before gently locking the screen without replying. It was not anger that kept him silent. It was the understanding that some conversations require calm hearts more than immediate answers. William noticed the thoughtful expression on his grandson's face, but did not ask what had happened. Instead, he walked slowly toward the window and stood beside Ethan, looking out across the snow-covered city. Sometimes life waits until people are finally quiet before it allows them to hear the truth, he said softly. Ethan smiled faintly. I think she finally heard it today. William nodded. Perhaps. The important question is whether she also heard herself. Those words remained in Ethan's mind long after the meeting ended. By early afternoon, the headquarters had grown noticeably quieter. Most executives had left to spend Christmas with their families, and only a small leadership team remained to ensure the transition continued smoothly. Ethan reviewed several community investment programs before signing approval for expanded educational scholarships and additional support for employee emergency assistance. Daniel watched him with quiet admiration. Most new chairmen spend their first day reviewing profits, he observed. Ethan looked up from the reports. Profits matter, but people remember who stood beside them when life became difficult. Daniel smiled. That explains why your grandfather trusted you. Several miles away, Olivia sat alone inside a quiet neighborhood coffee shop after leaving her parents' house. She had chosen a small table near the window where snowflakes drifted slowly past the glass. Her untouched cup of coffee had grown cold while she continued reading article after article about Carter Global's leadership transition. Every report described Ethan as thoughtful, humble, and deeply respected by those who had worked with him. None of the articles focused on luxury or wealth. Instead, they mentioned years of anonymous charitable donations, employee education programs, and long-term investments in struggling communities. Olivia quietly closed her eyes. She suddenly remembered dozens of ordinary evenings when Ethan had volunteered at local food drives, quietly repaired furniture for neighborhood families, or spent weekends mentoring young entrepreneurs without ever mentioning it afterward. She had admired his kindness, yet somewhere along the way she began believing kindness alone was not enough. The realization settled heavily inside her heart. She reached for her phone again and slowly typed another message. I do not want to discuss money. I only want the chance to apologize honestly. She hesitated before pressing send. Ethan read the new message several minutes later while sitting alone inside his office overlooking the winter skyline. He appreciated that the words carried no excuses, no attempts to explain away the past, only a simple request. He thought carefully before answering. Finally, he typed a brief reply. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, the public garden beside Riverside Library. Olivia read the response almost immediately. Relief mixed quietly with nervousness. She knew a conversation could not erase everything that had happened. Still, gratitude replaced uncertainty because he had at least agreed to meet. Christmas afternoon slowly turned toward evening. Ethan returned to the Carter estate where family members had gathered for a modest holiday dinner. Unlike the extravagant celebrations he had attended elsewhere over the years, this gathering centered on conversation rather than appearances. William asked everyone to share one lesson they had learned during the past year. When it became Ethan's turn, he thought for a moment before answering. I learned that people can misunderstand your circumstances without ever truly understanding your character. That is painful, but allowing disappointment to change your character would be far worse. The room remained quietly reflective after his words. William raised his glass with a gentle smile. To character. Everyone echoed the toast. Later that evening, Ethan walked alone through the estate gardens. Fresh snow covered every path while small lanterns illuminated the trees with soft golden light. The peaceful silence gave him space to think about everything that had changed within 24 hours. He no longer carried the uncertainty that had followed him for years. The future remained unwritten, but for the first time it also felt honest. Across town, Olivia stood beside the living room window of her parents' home looking at the same falling snow. Her father approached quietly before placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. I have spent all day thinking about last night, he admitted. I judged a man by what I thought he lacked instead of appreciating what he quietly gave. Olivia nodded without taking her eyes off the snowy street. I did the same thing. Her father sighed softly. If he forgives us, it will say more about him than it ever could about us. Olivia whispered, almost to herself, I am not asking him to come back. I only hope he believes that I finally understand. The house became silent once more. Outside, Christmas lights reflected across the fresh snow while distant church bells welcomed the peaceful evening. Neither Ethan nor Olivia knew exactly what tomorrow's conversation would bring. They only knew that truth had finally replaced assumptions, and sometimes that is the first step toward healing, even when it cannot restore what has already been lost. 1 year later, Christmas arrived beneath another gentle snowfall, but everything about Ethan's life felt different. The city wore the same white blanket of winter. Church bells echoed through the crisp morning air, and families gathered around decorated trees exactly as they had 12 months earlier. Yet this Christmas carried none of the uncertainty that had followed him on the night. He quietly walked away from the only marriage he had ever wanted to protect. Instead of standing alone outside a closed front door, Ethan stood in the courtyard of the Carter Foundation Community Center, watching hundreds of children laugh as volunteers distributed warm coats, holiday meals, books, and carefully wrapped presents. The foundation had expanded dramatically during the past year, funding scholarships, supporting small businesses, and creating emergency assistance programs for families facing difficult times. Carter Global had experienced one of its strongest years in company history, not because it pursued reckless expansion, but because it invested in people with the same patience Ethan believed every worthwhile relationship deserved. Employees trusted their leadership, communities welcomed new partnerships, and shareholders discovered that integrity could be every bit as profitable as ambition. William Carter often smiled whenever reporters asked how the company had achieved such remarkable success. His answer never changed. We stopped asking how much value people could create for the company. We started asking how much value the company could create for people. Ethan had quietly become the face of that philosophy, without ever trying to become its symbol. That Christmas morning, he wore a simple navy winter coat instead of an expensive overcoat, greeting volunteers by name, and carrying boxes alongside everyone else. Children did not know he chaired one of the nation's largest corporations. They only knew he always knelt to speak with them at eye level and somehow remembered their names from the previous year. Daniel approached carrying a clipboard before smiling. Everything has been delivered. The final family just arrived. Ethan looked toward the entrance where parents and children walked inside, smiling beneath gently falling snow. Good, he answered. No one should feel forgotten on Christmas. Later that afternoon, as the last volunteers finished cleaning the community center, Ethan stepped outside into the quiet winter air. Across the parking lot, he noticed a familiar figure standing beside a small silver sedan. Olivia waited patiently with both hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee. She had not come unexpectedly. Several weeks earlier, she had written asking whether she could personally thank him for supporting a literacy program that now served neighborhoods where she volunteered every weekend. Ethan walked toward her with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the past year. "Merry Christmas," he said warmly. Olivia smiled gently. "Merry Christmas, Ethan." They stood together for a moment watching snow drift across the empty parking lot. There was no awkwardness anymore, only the quiet respect that sometimes grows after people finally accept the truth. Olivia spoke first. "I wanted you to know something." Ethan listened without interrupting. "This past year changed my life in ways I never expected. Not because I learned who you were, but because I finally understood who I had become. I spent too many years measuring success by appearances instead of character." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "We all learn at different moments." She smiled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you for forgiving me that day in the garden. You never gave me false hope, but you also never gave me bitterness." Ethan looked toward the children laughing inside the community center. "Bitterness only keeps people trapped in yesterday." Olivia followed his gaze before speaking once more. "Are you happy?" Ethan answered honestly. "Yes, not because life became perfect, but because it became honest." She accepted that answer with a peaceful smile. "I am happy too. It took time, but I finally learned that losing something important can teach lessons success never could." They exchanged one final smile before Olivia extended her hand. Ethan shook it warmly. There was no need for another goodbye because neither of them carried unfinished words anymore. She returned to her car and quietly drove away while Ethan remained standing beneath the softly falling snow. As evening settled over the city, he walked back inside the community center where William waited beside the glowing Christmas tree decorated with ornaments created by local children. The older man looked around the joyful room before turning toward his grandson. "Do you remember what I asked you the night you came home?" Ethan smiled. "You asked whether I wanted leadership because of power or because I believed responsibility was an act of service." William nodded proudly. "You answered correctly then. You have proven it every day since." Ethan looked at the handwritten ornament hanging near the top of the tree. It simply read, "Kindness always finds its way home." He smiled quietly because those 5 words described the journey better than any headline ever could. 1 year earlier, he had been turned away from a house that no longer believed in him. Today, he stood surrounded by people whose lives had been strengthened not by his inheritance, but by his choices. He finally understood that the greatest legacy a person leaves behind is never measured by the fortune they receive. It is measured by the hope they create, the dignity they protect, and the kindness they continue offering even after the world gives them every reason to stop.